Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. Hugh Fraser Stewart later became St. John's College Dean at Cambridge in 1907, but 16 years earlier, he had this to say about On the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. He said it's by far the most interesting example of prison literature the world has ever seen. Obviously, Boethius is more than just a house here at Trinity Classical Academy. We're going to be talking about Boethius, who he was, what is it about this famous writing of his on the Consolation of Philosophy, and our guest today is Zach Weichbrodt. He teaches medieval literature. He's our senior class thesis class coordinator. He's chair of Trinity's Humanities Department, and he is the dean of classical learning here at Trinity. Zach, welcome. It's great to have you here for the second episode of this season.
I'm happy to be here. Boethius is a great cellmate.
Yes, indeed. What is prison literature? I guess it's self-defining, but what is it?
That idea that whenever everything is taken away from you, what do you have left? Whether it's all of the circumstances that dramatically influenced your life, whether it's all of the things that defined yourself when you were on the outside, when all those things are stripped away and all you have left is what you can carry on your body and what you carry in your soul. What does life look like when viewed through that lens? That's maybe one way of thinking about prison literature is what is man when he is stripped bare?
Yes.
And where does his mind go whenever he starts to reflect on his life and all the twists and turns that took him to maybe that very stark place where there's not much left to do but sit and reflect. And Boethius is, as your quote ably shows, maybe the premier example of how that kind of reflection can be something that edifies us. You mentioned some of the luminaries who have been attracted to Boethius. And this is one of those works that has been the stuff of translation. Let me say that again, that some of the most eminent people in the world have thought fit to translate into a different language. King Alfred, Queen Elizabeth, all took a turn at trying to translate the Consolation of Philosophy. So it's more than worthy of our attention as it's been worthy of the attention of some of the most impressive human beings that history has seen.
That's great. Well, we want to get into some details about On the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. But first, a little bit, who is he? Why do we study him here at Trinity Classical Academy?
So Boethius, or we could call him Boethius if we want to be Latin about it, he's one of those humans where you think, I have wasted my life because I have not accomplished a thimbleful of the things he had done by the time he was like 14. He was a polymath of the highest order. He was one of those exemplary figures who was great at everything and so often didn't really care about the things that went along with that greatness. He was orphaned at a fairly early age. Fortune or Providence smiled upon him. He was adopted into an influential Roman family. He made his way up through the educational system and into civil service at the time, which was really kind of the main professional pathway available to someone like him. And he very quickly proved his worth to the Roman king. At that point, they were being ruled by the barbarians, so there were no more emperors, but the Roman king of the time found him just incredibly useful in a variety of ways. He invented water clocks. He set the program of music for visiting dignitaries. He conducted diplomacy missions. He invented and he refined and he translated. And so pretty much anything that you could be good at, he was and was useful for it. And that became an issue for him when he was one of the most influential persons and didn't seem to care about that influence or to use it. So everyone else who was scrabbling to gain an entry into the inner circle of the king saw Boethius, who was in that inner circle, and didn't really care about the status that came from him and in fact scorned it. And it made him a little bit of a target for some problems that emerged later on in his life.
Right. So clearly talent-wise, a Renaissance man, long before the Renaissance. And you went into the context a little bit about him. So he's well-educated. He's in the I guess he was even a Roman senator of sorts, what was left of it. It was being ruled by the barbarians. He was an advisor to the king. What happened? Let's take the context further. How did he end up in prison?
So it's one of those issues that is definitely shrouded in mystery, but we have more than a few historical clues. Boethius also, in this book, The Consolation, he gives his own account, and the details that we have seem to corroborate what had happened. In addition to being talented and influential, Boethius was also an unapologetic Orthodox Christian in a time when Rome was being ruled by people who had been evangelized by the heretical Arians, and so had some dubious beliefs about if Jesus really was God, and what it means for him to be the Son of God, and if he was created or begotten. And so at a time whenever people who stuck to the tenets of the Nicene Creed, Boethius was definitely a sore thumb on the western side of the Roman Empire, because he had all the beliefs that their kind of suspicious cousins to the east in Byzantium held. And so a lot of the Arians at the court held Boethius in some suspicion because he was so outspoken and was very willing to stake his reputation on writing and debating for what he thought the orthodox truth of Christianity was. So that, combined with his influential position and, frankly, his virtue, the fact that he didn't care about his power, didn't care about his influence, and according to his own account, used those things to stand up for the innocent when they were being falsely condemned. When powerful and rich men were trying to exploit others to gain more power, he stood up and refused to let them pervert the instruments of justice and get their way. So he made himself a target for quite a few people, and it's a little bit unclear what exactly happened. In Boethius's account, he found out that some men had been trumping up false letters to accuse senators with of treason against the king. And because Boethius already had some affinities and some affiliations that made him suspicious, he was then denounced as a suppressor of that treasonous information. And whenever he went and tried to give his side of the story and show that he wasn't actually suppressing evidence, he was trying to prevent falsehoods from being circulated, he was condemned to exile and ultimately to death without even the opportunity to have the trial that was due to him as a Roman citizen or offer any kind of defense. So in his telling, and again, the history that we have seems to corroborate this, he was very much a victim of the machinations of some of the wicked around him who found him an easy target to blame a lot on. He was even charged for witchcraft, which is kind of always the cherry on top of the fabricated evidence Sunday when we look at history.
So he's very much a real historical figure of the hero mythos, and standing up for the innocent and standing for truth. So he finds himself in prison, down from these elevated positions, and he needs consolation, and hence the title of his great piece on the consolation of philosophy. Who or what is philosophy in his piece? Let's set the stage for this great work of his, this great prison literature.
So the story begins in the book with Boethius very understandably weeping and wailing and bemoaning his lot in life. It's not just the fact that he has been exiled from his home and taken from his wife and family. It's not just the fact that his reputation has been sullied and that people believe that he has done the exact opposite of the true and good and noble things that he's done. It's not just that all of his beloved library books are far removed from him and he'll never get to see them again, and he's facing down death. It's that all of the things that he dedicated his life to now seem to have vanished away from him. He tried to follow philosophy and the principles of virtue that he, and sometimes it seemed like he alone followed in his circle of people, and look where it got him, right? With the reputation of a traitorous villain. He tried to not just be a nerd in the closet reading his books, but going out and using his learning and using his virtue for the good of his community. And look where that got him, right? Again, becoming the villain, being ejected from all of those responsibilities that he didn't really want in the first place, but he had sought to find a positive use for, right? For the sake of justice and for the sake of good. And he's wondering, I worked really hard and sacrificed a lot just to get nothing from it. I wish I were dead. And it's frustrating that the one time that I want this, when you call out to death, death doesn't hear you. Right? Whenever you actually want things to be over, you don't even get that opportunity. You're just stuck enduring more pain and more disgrace. And so he's in this deeply emotional emo moment, and he writes himself, even though he has a lot of just causes for that frustration and anger, he writes himself being scolded by the entrance of this imperious woman who casts out all of the muses who have been, as he writes, habituating him to his sickness of mind, right? Filling him with the thorns of passion which slay the fruitful and rich harvest of reason. So he paints himself in this unsympathetic mode of somebody who is like, a 14-year-old who has just had his first breakup, right? Except for he's a grown man who has just endured grave injustice. But he lets us see him in this kind of vulnerable moment to show how even the wisest, even the most disciplined can fall prey to the same things that anyone, however young or however old, can be thrown off of the course of virtue and self-discipline by.
And so philosophy is the character, the Dame Wisdom, almost, very similar to Proverbs 8 type character, who comes in and speaks some truth into these places where he finds himself. And what are her initial responses? What does philosophy say to our poor, grieving Boethius?
One of the lovely things about this book is that even though Boethius has many false thoughts circulating in his mind, even though he has a lot of anger and frustration, philosophy doesn't begin just by scolding him. Right? She's trying to diagnose his problem. She's willing to listen. She wants him to talk. So she doesn't just breeze in and read him the riot act. In fact, in one of the more striking moments, she takes the folds of her dress and wipes the tears from his eyes whenever she realizes he doesn't even recognize me. He doesn't even know who I am. And in that moment, he's brought back to his childhood. He's brought back to being a boy and learning for the first time the principles of philosophy and what it means to seek truth and not just pleasure, not just convenience. Seek what is and not just the appearance of things. And that tender moment of healing starts him on this journey where he realizes it's not just that he's been exiled from his home, that he's been exiled from his people, but he's wandered away from himself. He doesn't know who this philosophy is, but he also has kind of forgotten who he is. He's wandered away from himself, and he needs to be found again before he can start asking and getting answers to the big questions that are plaguing him at this moment in his life.
So we see philosophy not only having wisdom and answers, but wisdom in the very way she approaches his needs, his condition. So I can see why we would want the students to hear this. In your observations, how have you seen a study of Boethius, specifically on the consolation of philosophy as she consoles and enlightens him? How have you seen it affecting the students?
It's pretty powerful for students to see someone from over 1,500 years ago asking some of the same questions that they ask. Why do bad people seem to get away with whatever they want? What exactly is true happiness, and why am I so miserable, right? Why does God care about anything that I do or anything that happens to me? And if he does, why does it feel so terrible, and why do I feel so alone? Boethius is asking all of those questions as he is dealing with the wreckage of his life. And one of the amazing things about the consolation of philosophy is you might be expecting a very dry series of syllogisms that declare propositions that show why you're dumb and all of your problems are dumb. But philosophy shows a tenderness in seeking clarity of thought with Boethius, but then also winning him to that truth with the enchantment of poetry. This book features some of the most beautiful poems that I can think of that are all designed to win Boethius, lead him closer to what's true. And so as he's reckoning with the problem of evil, as he's reckoning with the problem of human free will, as he's reckoning with the problem of what does it mean to live a life well, and what exactly is happiness, and is that even possible for us in this life? He's getting beautiful clarity, but also beautiful poetry, and they're working together. So in some cases, you have students who are reading this and thinking, wow, I've never heard the question asked quite like that, or I've heard the Sunday school answer to this, but I've never understood how it's true or why it's true. Mm-hmm. And so often in this book, Boethius is able to articulate conclusions maybe that are familiar to us, but with a logical rigor that helps cement them firmly in our minds as the truth, and then with a beauty and with a style that wins us to that truth at the same time. So in some cases, we come to some very simple conclusions about what false happiness is, right? Lady Philosophy says, false happiness is found in anything which can be taken away from you. If it is going to make you happy, then it has to be immortal, it has to be immaterial, and it has to be immutable, right? It can't be destroyed, it can't be changed, it can't be taken away from you, because if it can, then happiness can be lost. So if we don't think we live in a universe where our happiness is in constant peril, then true happiness has to be the opposite of those things. And she also points out just some very common sense things. We often pursue happiness as the result of other things. We get money, we get wealthy, and therefore we're happy. We get glory, and therefore we're happy. And she says it's just the opposite, actually. When we are happy, all of these things are added unto us. And so we essentially confuse causes and effects, and it's only when we're happy that we actually become happy. So some of these very simple, common sense Sunday school type answers have a clarity, have a depth, and have a winsomeness to them that is really unmatched. And I think that students feel the power of that, having their hard questions asked, answered with clarity, but winningly.
Is it fair to say this to some, or at least to me, not an expert in any means, but is it fair to say this can look like a blend of the theodicy of Job, the wisdom of Dame Wisdom in Proverbs, but there's also some Greek influence, some Platonic and Aristotelian influence here? Was Boethius making a deliberate effort to do that, or did it just result, or is that known? I mean, I know that's a very broad question, but I'm just curious. Boethius being so brilliant and so well educated, he obviously was well aware of the Greek literature and as a Christian knew the Bible well. Was he bringing these things in formally and deliberately, or just a result of what he knew to be true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Boethius is known in intellectual history as a great synthesizer. So maybe he didn't come up with the most original ideas, but the way he was able to put together different ideas in a kind of harmony and in a kind of unity stands on its own and is something that Western civilization benefited from for centuries after his life and after his death. And so whether it's the philosophy of Plato or the logic of Aristotle or his own biblical learning or his understanding of Christian theology, he's always bringing these together and in ways that are kind of seamless, right? Mm-hmm. He wears his learning very lightly. And this is another model I think that I find myself impacted by and that our students find themselves impacted by, is that he's able to take everything that he has learned and it's inside of him. He doesn't need to go look at his study notes. He doesn't need to go catch up with a professor to remind him of all those cool things that they learned in Philosophy 101. Everything that he's dealing with is in his memory, is in his soul. And so he's able to quote Plato without needing to look up a book. He's able to, while he is awaiting an unjust death sentence, remember all of the things that he has learned and synthesize that into a new form. And for people, for students who learn something for a test and forget it 2 weeks later, this model of what are you learning that you can carry with you, that in the traumas of your life, that in your darkest moments, that's going to abide in your soul and speak life into you, to shed light in a dark time. Are you putting those kinds of things inside of you? Or are you going to be in those dark times, in those moments where you need help? Are you going to be even more lost and vulnerable because you haven't implanted those things in your soul, those things that you've been learning and gaining throughout the course of your education? Have they just kind of stayed floating outside of you, or have they penetrated inside and become living things rooted in you that can bear fruit at the right time? And so in some ways, he's a model student. He's somebody who has learned for the sake of life, his life, and the ability to speak life into others. And I know that I certainly can't bear witness to the same thing in my own studies, but that's an attractive ideal for all of us to have, is why do I need to learn this? so that whenever you are falsely accused of things that you didn't do and ripped away from everything, you can still find not just a reason for living, but a true reason for living that you can articulate wisely and winsomely so that others might also be won to that same path, towards hope and towards virtue, against despair and against that temptation to just give in and give up.
That is a fantastic challenge to the students and parents out there. I hope this makes you want to sit down with a copy of On the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius and read it. And if you're one of the parents, you may be wondering, well, what should I ask my student at home about Boethius? I want to see if they've really gathered this incredible wisdom of the seamless synthesis. I love that terminology, Zach. What are some questions, or what is a question that a parent might want to ask their student about this wonderful prison literature?
Maybe some of the best questions are just the questions that Boethius himself asks, right? One of the most memorable sections of the book, Boethius is reckoning with the problem of evil. What is evil, right? If God created everything, did he create evil too? Where does evil come from? Especially if we believe in a universe that God created and ordered all things. How do we get evil? Is there any kind of answer to that makes sense of what we see in the world around us, but also respects what the Bible and some philosophy seems to teach as well about where the universe came from? And he comes to what might come across as like a kind of a tricksy, clever conclusion. He says, evil in the end is nothing. Right? Evil is not a thing. And one of his famous arguments is, whatever God is that which nothing greater can be conceived of. So surely there is no capability that he lacks. If God is truly God, he can do anything. But God can't do evil. So what is evil? It's the thing God cannot do. What can God not do? There's nothing God can't do. Oh, so evil is nothing. And so even though that has almost the charm of a trick to it,
sure,
he elaborates a powerful and profound justification for that reasoning, where he wants to show ultimately that evil is like an illness. Evil is like an absence. Evil is like darkness. It's not a thing, it's our term, our concept for describing the absence of what should be. So when we ask where evil comes from, he's not asking how some kind of sneaky fox got into the garden from, some mysterious portal outside of the universe. He's saying, how do we go from good to lack, to absence? And there's plenty of models available for that, but one of the things that's amazing about Boethius is he's not just trying to give us an intellectual answer to satisfy intellectual questions. He wants to find a way to turn that answer, evil is nothing, to better understanding how we reckon with the world around us. Wait, evil's nothing, so these people who falsely accused me and stole my property and are in the process of trying to enslave and imprison others, they're doing a nothing? How does that make sense? And if we think of evil as nothing, what does that mean for how good and just men seek to respond? One of his answers is that there is nothing you can do to hurt someone more than what is in their own power to hurt themselves, right? You can't impose a punishment. You can't impose a consequence on anyone that is worse than the unhappiness that only they can bring upon themselves. We're happy by our own choice and participation in God. We're unhappy whenever we choose to turn away from him. No one else can make that choice for you, so nobody can inflict any harm or consequence on you that's worse than your own actions making yourself miserable. So what does that mean for how we prosecute criminals? What does that mean for how we assign punishments for wrongdoing? What does that mean for how we reward and celebrate virtue and good actions? So he's interested in those deep and powerful intellectual questions, but in a way that demands there be a practical application that changes how we live our lives as individuals and as whole communities.
How interesting that darkness is the absence of light. Jesus is the light of the world. The darkness does not understand the Word made flesh. He tells us, you are the light of the world. Truth, of course, is light. Wow, folks. I think this, I could sit here for all night till dawn and talk about this. And I cannot imagine anyone hearing this podcast who has not read On the Consolation of Philosophy, who would not want to get a hold of a copy as soon as you can and sit down and enjoy this feast. And also, if you're a student who's had the pleasure to sit with Mr. Weichbrodt and study this piece, or if you're a parent of a student, I hope you realize what great reasons for rejoicing you have. This is a marvelous, marvelous thing to experience. So, Zach, Mr. Weichbrodt, thank you not only for being here tonight, but for teaching this and doing it so well. I think it is so encouraging to people to see this bit of classical Christian education and how you do it so well. Thank you so very much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us tonight on the Classical Academy podcast. It is a presentation of Trinity U, which is a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer, and he provides our original music. And until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom and to grow in virtue and in the love of God. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.